Chapters 16 and 17 of Phineas Finn. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Evers. Phineas Finn by Anthony Trollope. Chapter 16. Phineas Finn returns to Killaloe. Phineas Finn's first session of Parliament was over. His first session with all its adventures. When he got back to Mrs. Bunce's house, for Mrs. Bunce received him for a night in spite of her husband's advice to the contrary, I am afraid he almost felt that Mrs. Bunce and her rooms were beneath him. Of course he was very unhappy, as wretched as a man can be. There were moments in which he thought that it would hardly become him to live unless he could do something to prevent the marriage of Lady Laura and Mr. Kennedy. But nevertheless he had his consolations. These were reflections which had in them much of melancholy satisfaction. He had not been despised by the woman to whom he had told his love. She had not shown him that she thought him to be unworthy of her. She had not regarded his love as an offence. Indeed, she had almost told him that prudence alone had forbidden her to return his passion. And he had kissed her, and had afterwards parted from her as a dear friend. I do not know why there should have been a flavour of exquisite joy in the midst of his agony as he thought of this, but it was so. He would never kiss her again. All future delights of that kind would belong to Mr. Kennedy, and he had no real idea of interfering with that gentleman in the fruition of his privileges. But still there was the kiss, an eternal fact. And then, in all respects except that of his love, his visit to Loughlinter had been pre-eminently successful. Mr. Monk had become his friend, and had encouraged him to speak during the next session, setting before him various models, and prescribing for him a course of reading. Lord Brentford had become intimate with him. He was on pleasant terms with Mr. Palliser and Mr. Gresham. And as for Mr. Kennedy, he and Mr. Kennedy were almost bosom friends. It seemed to him that he had quite surpassed the Ratlers, Fitzgibbons, and Bonteens in that politico-social success which goes so far towards downright political success, and which in itself is so pleasant. He had surpassed these men in spite of their offices and their acquired positions, and could not but think that even Mr. Lowe, if he knew it all, would confess that he had been right. As to his bosom friendship with Mr. Kennedy, that, of course, troubled him. Ought he not to be driving a poniard into Mr. Kennedy's heart? The conventions of life forbade that, and therefore the bosom friendship was to be excused. If not an enemy to the death, then there could be no reason why he should not be a bosom friend. He went over to Ireland, staying but one night with Mrs. Bunce, and came down upon them at Killaloe like a god out of heavens. Even his father was well-nigh overwhelmed by admiration, and his mother and sisters thought themselves only fit to minister to his pleasures. He had learned, if he had learned nothing else, to look as though he were master of the circumstances around him, and was entirely free from internal embarrassment. When his father spoke to him about his legal studies, he did not exactly laugh at his father's ignorance, but he recapitulated to his father so much of Mr. Monk's wisdom at second hand, showing plainly that it was his business to study the arts of speech and the technicalities of the House, and not to study law, that his father had nothing further to say. He had become a man of such dimensions that an ordinary father could hardly dare to inquire into his proceedings, and as for an ordinary mother, such as Mrs. Finn certainly was, she could do no more than look after her son's linen with awe. Mary Flood Jones, the reader I hope will not quite have forgotten Mary Flood Jones, was in a great tremor when first she met the hero of Loch Shane after returning from the honours of his first session. She had been somewhat disappointed because the newspapers had not been full of the speeches he had made in Parliament, and indeed the ladies of the Finn household had all been ill at ease on this head. They could not imagine why Phineas had restrained himself with so much philosophy. But Miss Flood Jones, in discussing the matter with the Miss Finns, had never expressed the slightest doubts of his capacity or his judgment. And when tidings came, the tidings came in a letter from Phineas to his father, that he did not intend to speak that session, because speeches from a young member on his first session were thought to be inexpedient, Miss Flood Jones and the Miss Finns were quite willing to accept the wisdom of this decision, much as they might regret the effect of it. Mary, when she met her hero, had hardly dared to look him in the face, but she remembered accurately all the circumstances of her last interview with him. Could it be that he wore that ringlet near his heart? Mary had received from Barbara Finn certain hairs supposed to have come from the head of Phineas, and these she always wore near her own. And moreover, since she had seen Phineas, she had refused an offer of marriage from Mr. Elias Bodkin, had refused it almost ignominiously, and when doing so had told herself that she would never be false to Phineas Finn. "We think it so good of you to come to see us again," she said. "Good to come home to my own people? Of course you might be staying with plenty of grandees if you liked it." "No, indeed, Mary. It did happen by accident that I had to go to the house of a man whom perhaps you would call a grandee, and to meet grandees there. But it was only for a few days, and I am very glad to be taken in again here, I can assure you." "You know how very glad we all are to have you." "Are you glad to see me, Mary?" "Very glad. Why should I not be glad? And Barbara, the dearest friend I have in the world. Of course she talks about you, and that makes me think of you." "If you knew, Mary, how often I think about you!" Then Mary, who was very happy at hearing such words, and who was walking in to dinner with him at the moment, could not refrain herself from pressing his arm with her little fingers. She knew that Phineas in his position could not marry at once, but she would wait for him, oh, for ever, if he would only ask her. He, of course, was a wicked traitor to tell her that he was wont to think of her. But Jove smiles at lovers' perjuries, and it is well that he should do so, as such perjuries can hardly be avoided altogether in the difficult circumstances of a successful gentleman's life. Phineas was a traitor, of course, but he was almost forced to be a traitor by the simple fact that Lady Laura Standish was in London and Mary Flood Jones in Killaloe. He remained for nearly 5 months at Killaloe, and I doubt whether his time was altogether well spent. Some of the books recommended to him by Mr. Monk he probably did read, and was often to be found encompassed by blue books. I fear that there was a grain of pretence about his blue books and parliamentary papers, and that in these days he was, in a gentle way, something of an impostor. "You must not be angry with me for not going to you," he said once to Mary's mother when he declined an invitation to drink tea, "but the fact is that my time is not my own." "Pray don't make any apologies. We are quite aware that we have very little to offer," said Mrs. Flood Jones, who was not altogether happy about Mary, and who perhaps knew more about members of Parliament and blue books than Phineas Finn had supposed. "Mary, you are a fool to think of that man," the mother said to her daughter the next morning. "I don't think of him, mamma, not particularly." "He is no better than anybody else that I can see, and he is beginning to give himself airs," said Mrs. Flood Jones. Mary made no answer, but she went up into her room and swore before a figure of the Virgin that she would be true to Phineas for ever and ever, in spite of her mother, in spite of all the world, in spite, should it be necessary, even of himself. About Christmas time there came a discussion between Phineas and his father about money. "I hope you find you get on pretty well," said the doctor, who thought that he had been liberal. "It's a tight fit," said Phineas, who was less afraid of his father than he had been when he last discussed these things. "I had hoped it would have been ample," said the doctor. "I don't think for a moment, sir, that I am complaining," said Phineas. "I know it is much more than I have a right to expect." The doctor began to make an inquiry within his own breast as to whether his son had a right to expect anything, whether the time had not come in which his son should be earning his own bread. "I suppose," he said after a pause, "there is no chance of you doing anything at the bar now?" "Not immediately. It's almost impossible to combine the two studies together." Mr. Lowe himself was aware of that. "But you are not to suppose that I have given the profession up?" "I hope not, after all the money it has cost us." "By no means, sir. And all that I am doing now will, I trust, be of assistance to me when I shall come back to work at the law. Of course, it is on the cards that I may go into office, and if so, public business will become my profession." "Be turned out with the ministry?" "Yes, that is true, sir. I must run my chance. If the worst comes to the worst, I hope I might be able to secure some permanent place. I should think that I can hardly fail to do so, but I trust I may never be driven to want it. I thought, however, that we had settled all this before." Then Phineas assumed a look of injured innocence, as though his father was driving him too hard. "And in the meantime your money has been enough?" said the doctor, after a pause. "I had intended to ask you to advance me £100," said Phineas. "There were expenses to which I was driven on first entering Parliament." £100? If it be inconvenient, sir, I can do without it." He had not as yet paid for his gun, or for that velvet coat in which he had been shooting, or most probably for the knickerbockers. He knew he wanted the £100 badly, but he felt ashamed of himself in asking for it. If he were once in office, though the office were but a sorry junior lordship, he would repay his father instantly. "You shall have it, of course," said the doctor, "but do not let the necessity for asking for more hundreds come oftener than you can help." Phineas said that he would not, and then there were no further discourses about money. It need hardly be said that he told his father nothing of that bill which he had endorsed for Lawrence Fitzgibbon. At last came the time which called him again to London and the glories of London life, to lobbies and the clubs and the gossip of men in office and the chance of promotion for himself, to the glare of the gas lamps, the mock anger of rival debaters, and the prospect of the Speaker's wig. During the idleness of the recess he had resolved at any rate upon this, that a month of the session should not have passed by before he had been seen upon his legs in the House, had been seen and heard, and many a time as he had wandered alone with his gun across the bogs which lie on the other side of the Shannon from Killaloe, he had practised the sort of address which he would make to the House. He would be short, always short, and he would eschew all action and gesticulation. Mr. Monk had been very urgent in his instructions to him on that head, but he would be especially careful that no words should escape him which had not in them some purpose. He might be wrong in his purpose, but purpose there should be. He had been twitted more than once at Killaloe with his silence, for it had been conceived by his fellow townsmen that he had been sent to Parliament on the special ground of his eloquence. They should twit him no more on his next return. He would speak and would carry the House with him if a human effort might prevail. So he packed up his things and started again for London in the beginning of February. "Good-bye, Mary," he said with his sweetest smile, but on this occasion there was no kiss and no culling of locks. "I know he cannot help it," said Mary to herself. "It is his position, but whether it be for good or evil, I will be true to him." "I am afraid you are unhappy," Barbara Finn said to her on the next morning. "No, I am not unhappy, not at all. I have a deal to make me happy and proud. I don't mean to be a bit unhappy." Then she turned away and cried heartily, and Barbara Finn cried with her for company. Chapter 17. Phineas Finn returns to London. Phineas had received 2 letters during his recess at Killaloe from 2 women who admired him much, which, as they were both short, shall be submitted to the reader. The first was as follows: Salisbury, October 20th, 1860. My dear Mr. Finn, I write a line to tell you that our marriage is to be hurried on as quickly as possible. Mr. Kennedy does not like to be absent from Parliament, nor will he be content to postpone the ceremony till the session be over. The day fixed is the 3rd of December, and we will then go at once to Rome, and intend to be back in London by the opening of Parliament. Yours most sincerely, Laura Standish. Our London address will be No. 52, Grosvenor Place. To this he wrote an answer as short, expressing his ardent wishes that those winter hymeneals might produce nothing but happiness, and saying that he would not be in town many days before he knocked at the door of No. 52, Grosvenor Place. And the second letter was as follows: Great Marlborough Street, December 1860. Dear and honoured Sir, Bunce is getting ever so anxious about the rooms, and says as how he has a young equity draftsman and wife and babies would take the whole house, and all because Miss Pouncefoot said a word about her port wine, which any lady of her age might say in her tantrums and mean nothing after all. Me and Miss Pouncefoot's knowed each other for 7 years, and what's a word or two isn't meant after that. But, honoured sir, it's not about that as I write to trouble you, but to ask if I may say for certain that you'll take the rooms again in February. It's easy to let them for the month after Christmas because of the pantomimes. Only say at once, because Bunce is nagging me day after day. I don't want nobody's wife and baby to have to do for, and I'd sooner have a Parliament gent like yourself than any one else. Yours humbly and respectful, Jane Bunce. To this he replied that he would certainly come back to the rooms in Great Marlborough Street, should he be so lucky enough to find them vacant, and he expressed his willingness to take them on and from the 1st of February. And on the 3rd of February he found himself in the old quarters, Mrs. Bunce having contrived with much conjugal adroitness both to keep Miss Pouncefoot and to stave off the equity draftsman's wife and baby. Bunce, however, received Phineas very coldly, and told his wife the same evening that, as far as he could see, their lodger would never turn up to be a trump in the matter of the ballot. "If he means well, why did he go and stay with them lords down in Scotland? I knows all about it. I knows a man when I sees him. Mr. Lowe, who's looked out to be a jury judge some of these days, is a deal better, 'cause he knows what he's after." Immediately on his return to town, Phineas found himself summoned to a political meeting at Mr. Mildmay's house in St. James's Square. "We're going to begin in earnest this time," Barrington Erle said to him at the club. "I'm glad of that," said Phineas. "I suppose you heard all about it down at Loughlinter?" Now, in truth, Phineas had heard very little of any settled plan down at Loughlinter. He played a game of chess with Mr. Gresham, and had shot a stag with Mr. Palliser, and had discussed sheep with Lord Brentford, but had hardly heard a word about politics from any one of these influential gentlemen. From Mr. Monk he had heard much of a coming Reform Bill, but his communications with Mr. Monk had rather been private discussions, in which he had learned Mr. Monk's views on certain points, than revelations on the intention of the party to which Mr. Monk belonged. "I heard of nothing settled," said Phineas, "but I suppose we are to have a Reform Bill." "That's a matter of course." "And I suppose we are not to touch upon the question of the ballot." "That's the difficulty," said Barrington Erle. "But of course we shan't touch it as long as Mr. Mildmay is in the Cabinet. He will never consent to the ballot as First Minister of the Crown." "Nor would Gresham or Palliser," said Phineas, who did not choose to bring forward his greatest gun at first. "I don't know about Gresham. It's impossible to say what Gresham might bring himself to do. Gresham is a man who may go to any lengths before he has done." Planty Pal, for such was the name by which Mr. Plantagenet Palliser was ordinarily known among his friends, would of course go with Mr. Mildmay and the Duke. "And Monk is opposed to the ballot," said Phineas. "That's the question. No doubt he has assented to the proposition of a measure without the ballot, but if there should come a row, and men like Turnbull demand it, and the London mob kick up a shindy, I don't know how far Monk would be steady." "Whatever he says he'll stick to." "He's your leader, then?" asked Barrington. "I don't know that I have a leader. Mr. Mildmay leads our side, and if anybody leads me, he does. But I have great faith in Mr. Monk." "There's one who should go for the ballot to-morrow if it were brought forward stoutly," said Barrington Erle to Mr. Rattler a few minutes afterwards, pointing to Phineas as he spoke. "I don't think much of that young man," said Rattler. Mr. Bonteen and Mr. Rattler had put their heads together during that last evening at Loughlinter, and had agreed that they did not think much of Phineas Finn. Why did Mr. Kennedy go down off the mountain to get him a pony? Why did Mr. Gresham play chess with him? Mr. Rattler and Mr. Bonteen may have been right in making up their minds to think but little of Phineas Finn, but Barrington Erle had been quite wrong when he had said that Phineas would go for the ballot to-morrow. Phineas had made up his mind very strongly that he would always oppose the ballot. That he would hold the same opinion throughout his life no one should pretend to say, but in his present mood, and under the tuition which he had received from Mr. Monk, he was prepared to demonstrate, out of the House and in it, that the ballot was, as a political measure, unmanly, ineffective, and enervating. Enervating had been a great word with Mr. Monk, and Phineas had clung to it with admiration. The meeting took place at Mr. Mildmay's on the 3rd day of the session. Phineas had of course heard of such meetings before, but had never attended one. Indeed, there had been no such gathering when Mr. Mildmay's party came into power early in the last session. Mr. Mildmay and his men had then made their effort in turning out their opponents, and had been well pleased to rest a while upon their oars. Now, however, they must go again to work, and therefore the Liberal party was collected at Mr. Mildmay's house, in order that the Liberal party might be told what it was that Mr. Mildmay and his cabinet intended to do. Phineas Finn was quite in the dark as to what would be the nature of the performance on this occasion, and entertained some idea that every gentleman present would be called upon to express individually his assent or dissent in regard to the measure proposed. He walked to St. James's Square with Lawrence Fitzgibbon, but even with Fitzgibbon was ashamed to show his ignorance by asking questions. "After all," said Fitzgibbon, "this kind of thing means nothing. I know as well as possible, and so do you, what Mr. Mildmay will say, and then Gresham will say a few words, and then Turnbull will make a murmur, and then we shall all assent to anything or to nothing, and then it will be over." Still Phineas did not understand whether the assent required would or would not be an individual personal assent. When the affair was over, he found that he was disappointed, and that he might almost as well have stayed away from the meeting, except that he had attended at Mr. Mildmay's bidding, and had given a silent adhesion to Mr. Mildmay's plan of reform for that session. Lawrence Fitzgibbon had been very nearly correct in his description of what would occur. Mr. Mildmay made a long speech. Mr. Turnbull, the great radical of the day, the man who was supposed to represent what many call the Manchester school of politics, asked half a dozen questions. In answer to these, Mr. Gresham made a short speech. Then Mr. Mildmay made another speech, and then all was over. The gist of the whole thing was that there should be a reform bill, very generous in its enlargement of the franchise, but no ballot. Mr. Turnbull expressed his doubt whether this would be satisfactory to the country, but even Mr. Turnbull was soft in his tone and complacent in his manner. As there was no reporter present, that plan of turning private meetings at gentlemen's houses into public assemblies not having been as yet adopted, there could be no need for energy or violence. They went to Mr. Mildmay's house to hear Mr. Mildmay's plan, and they heard it. 2 days after this, Phineas was to dine with Mr. Monk. Mr. Monk had asked him in the lobby of the house. "I don't give dinner parties," he said, "but I should like you to come and meet Mr. Turnbull." Phineas accepted the invitation as a matter of course. There were many who said that Mr. Turnbull was the greatest man in the nation, and that the nation could be saved only by a direct obedience to Mr. Turnbull's instructions. Others said that Mr. Turnbull was a demagogue and at heart a rebel, that he was un-English, false, and very dangerous. Phineas was rather inclined to believe the latter statement, and as danger and dangerous men are always more attractive than safety and safe men, he was glad to have an opportunity of meeting Mr. Turnbull at dinner. In the meantime he went to call on Lady Laura, whom he had not seen since the last evening when he had spent in her company at Loughlinter, whom, when he was last speaking to her, he had kissed close beneath the falls of the Linter. He found her at home, and with her was her husband. "Here is a Darby and Joan meeting, is it not?" she said, getting up to welcome him. He had seen Mr. Kennedy before, and had been standing close to him during the meeting at Mr. Mildmay's. "I am very glad to find you both together." "But Robert is going away this instant," said Lady Laura. "Has he told you of your adventures at Rome?" "Not a word." "Then I must tell you, but not now. The dear old Pope was so civil to us, I came to think it quite a pity that he should be in trouble." "I must be off," said the husband, getting off, "but I shall meet you at dinner, I believe. Do you dine at Mr. Monk's?" "Yes, and I am asked expressly to hear Turnbull made a convert of you. There are only to be us four. Au revoir." Then Mr. Kennedy went, and Phineas found himself alone with Lady Laura. He hardly knew how to address her, and remained silent. He had not prepared himself for the interview as he ought to have done, and felt himself to be awkward. She evidently expected him to speak, and for a few seconds sat waiting for what he might say. At last she found that it was incumbent on her to begin. "Were you surprised at our suddenness when you got my note?" "A little. You had spoken of waiting." "I had never imagined that he would have been impetuous, and he seemed to think that even the business of getting himself married would not justify him staying away from Parliament. He is a rigid martinet in all matters of duty. I did not wonder that he should be in a hurry, but that you should submit. I told you that I should do just what the wise people told me. I asked papa, and he said that it would be better. So the lawyers were driven out of their minds, and the milliners out of their bodies, and the thing was done." "Who was there at the marriage?" "Oswald was not there. That I know is what you mean to ask. Papa said that he might come if he pleased. Oswald stipulated that he should be received as a son. Then my father spoke the hardest word that ever fell from his mouth." "What did he say?" "I will not repeat it, not altogether. but he said that Oswald was not entitled to a son's treatment. He was very sore about my money because Robert was so generous as to his settlement, so the breach between them is as wide as ever." "And where is Chiltern now?" said Phineas. "Down in Northamptonshire, staying at some inn from whence he hunts. He tells me that he is quite alone, that he never dines out, never has anyone to dine with him, that he hunts 5 or 6 days a week and reads at night." "That's not a bad sort of life." "Not if the reading is any good. But I cannot bear that he should be so solitary, and if he breaks down in it, then his companions will not be fit for him. Do you ever hunt?" "Oh yes, at home in County Clare all Irishmen hunt." "I wish you would go down to him and see him. He'd be delighted to have you." Phineas thought over the proposition before he answered it, and then made the reply that he had made once before. "I would do so, Lady Laura, but I have no money for hunting in England." "Alas, alas," said she, smiling, "how that hits one on every side. I might manage it for a couple of days in March." "Do not do what you think you ought not to do," said Lady Laura. "No, certainly, but I should like it, and if I can, I will." "He could mount you, I have no doubt. He has no other expense now, and keeps a stable full of horses. I think he has 7 or 8. And now tell me, Mr. Finn, when are you going to charm the house, or is your first intention to strike terror?" He blushed. He knew that he blushed as he answered, "Oh, I suppose I shall make some sort of attempt before long. I can't bear the idea of being a bore." "I think you ought to speak, Mr. Finn." "I do not know about that, but I certainly mean to try. There will be lots of opportunities about the new Reform Bill. Of course you know that Mr. Mildmay is going to bring it at once. You hear all that from Mr. Kennedy." "And papa has told me. I still see papa almost every day. You must call upon him. Mind you do." Phineas said that he certainly would. "Papa is very lonely now, and I sometimes feel that I have been almost cruel in deserting him. And I think that he has a horror of the house, especially later in the year, always fancying that he will meet Oswald. I'm so unhappy about it all, Mr. Finn." "Why doesn't your brother marry?" said Phineas, knowing nothing as yet of Lord Chiltern and Violet Effingham. "If he were to marry well, that would bring your father round." "Yes, it would. And why should he not?" Lady Laura paused before she answered, and then she told the whole story. "He is violently in love, and the girl he loves has refused him twice." "Is it with Miss Effingham?" asked Phineas, guessing the truth at once, and remembering what Miss Effingham had said to him when riding in the wood. "Yes, with Violet Effingham, my father's pet, his favourite, whom he loves next to myself, almost as well as myself, whom he would really welcome as a daughter. He would gladly make her mistress of his house and of Salisbury. Everything would then go smoothly." "But she does not like Lord Chiltern." "I believe she loves him in her heart, but she's afraid of him. As she says herself, a girl is bound to be so careful of herself. With all her seeming frolic, Violet Effingham is very wise." Phineas, though not conscious of anything akin to jealousy, was annoyed at the revelation made to him. Since he had heard that Lord Chiltern was in love with Miss Effingham, he did not like Lord Chiltern quite as well as he had done before. He himself had simply admired Miss Effingham and had taken pleasure in her society. But though this had been all, he did not like to hear of another man wanting to marry her, and he was almost angry with Lady Laura for saying that she believed Miss Effingham loved her brother. If Miss Effingham had twice refused Lord Chiltern, that ought to have been sufficient. It was not that Phineas was in love with Miss Effingham himself. As he was still violently in love with Lady Laura, any other love was of course impossible. But nevertheless there was something offensive to him in the story as it had been told. "If it be wisdom on her part," said he, answering Lady Laura's last words, "you cannot find fault with her for her decision." "I find no fault, but I think my brother would make her happy." Lady Laura, when she was left alone, at once reverted to the tone in which Phineas Finn had answered her remarks about Miss Effingham. Phineas was very ill able to conceal his thoughts, and wore his heart almost upon his sleeve. Can it be possible that he cares for her himself? That was the nature of Lady Laura's first question to herself upon the matter, and in asking herself that question she thought nothing of the disparity in rank or fortune between Phineas Finn and Violet Effingham. Nor did it occur to her as at all improbable that Violet might accept the love of him who had been so lately her own lover. But the idea grated against her wishes on two sides. She was most anxious that Violet should ultimately become her brother's wife, and she could not be pleased that Phineas should be able to love any woman. I must beg my readers not to be carried away by those last words into any erroneous conclusion. They must not suppose that Lady Laura Kennedy, the lately married bride, indulged a guilty passion for the young man who had loved her. Though she had probably thought often of Phineas Finn since her marriage, her thoughts had never been of a nature to disturb her rest. It had never occurred to her even to think that she regarded him with any feeling that was an offence to her husband. She would have hated herself had any such idea presented itself to her mind. She prided herself on being a pure, high-principled woman, who kept so strong a guard upon herself as to be nearly free from the dangers of those rocks upon which other women make shipwreck of their happiness. She took pride in this, and would then blame herself for her own pride. But though she so blamed herself, it never occurred to her to think that to her there might be danger of such shipwreck. She had put away from herself the idea of love when she had first perceived that Phineas had regarded her with more than friendship, and had accepted Mr. Kennedy's offer with an assured conviction that by doing so she was acting best for her own happiness and for that of all those concerned. She had felt the romance of the position to be sweet when Phineas had stood with her at the top of the falls of the Linter, and had told her of the hopes which he had dared to indulge. And when at the bottom of the falls he had presumed to take her in his arms, she had forgiven him without difficulty to herself, telling herself that that would be the alpha and the omega of the romance of her life. She had not felt herself bound to tell Mr. Kennedy of what had occurred, but she had felt that he could hardly have been angry even had he been told. And she had often thought of her lover since, and of his love, telling herself that she too had once had a lover, never regarding her husband in that light, but her thoughts had not frightened her as guilty thoughts will do. There had come a romance which had been pleasant, and it was gone. It had been soon banished, but it had left to her a sweet flavour, of which she loved to taste the sweetness, though she knew that it was gone. And the man should be her friend, but especially her husband's friend. It should be her care to see that his life was successful, and especially her husband's care. It was a great delight to her to know that her husband liked the man. And the man would marry, and the man's wife should be her friend. All this had been very pure and very pleasant. Now an idea had flitted across her brain that the man was in love with someone else, and she did not like it. But she did not therefore become afraid of herself, or in the least realize at once the danger of her own position. Her immediate glance of the matter did not go beyond the falseness of men. If it were so, as she suspected, if Phineas had in truth transferred his affections to Violet Effingham, of how little value is the love of such a man! It did not occur to her at this moment that she also had transferred hers to Robert Kennedy, or that, if not, she had done worse. But she did remember that in the autumn this young Phoebus among men had turned his back upon her out upon the mountain, that he might hide from her the agony of his heart when he learned that she was to be the wife of another man, and that now, before the winter was over, he could not hide from her the fact that his heart was elsewhere. And then she speculated and counted up facts, and satisfied herself that Phineas could not even have seen Violet Effingham since they two had stood together upon the mountain. How false are men! How false and how weak of heart! "Chiltern and Violet Effingham," said Phineas to himself as he walked away from Grosvenor Place. "Is it fair that she should be sacrificed because she is rich, and because she is so winning and so fascinating that Lord Brentford would receive even his son for the sake of receiving also such a daughter-in-law?" Phineas also liked Lord Chiltern, had seen or fancied that he had seen fine things in him, had looked forward to his regeneration, hoping perhaps that he might have some hand in the good work. But he did not recognize the propriety of sacrificing Violet Effingham even for work so good as this. If Miss Effingham had refused Lord Chiltern twice, surely that ought to be sufficient. It did not occur to him that the love of such a girl as Violet would be a great treasure to himself. As regarded himself, he was still in love, hopelessly in love, with Lady Laura Kennedy. End of chapter 17. Recording by Simon Evers.